webcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the Nonprofit Federation of DMA, a division of ANA. Today's webinar, Get Your Donors to Focus on Your Impact, Not Your Overhead, is sponsored by the DMANF Education Committee. I'm Jocelyn Argren, DMANF Director of Education and Events. We are proud to support informative events like today's webcast and hope you check our website at nonprofitfederation.org for more educational opportunities. Please make sure to join the conversation today and contribute any questions or thoughts you have by using the question function found on the right-hand side of your screen. We will do our best to address all of your questions at the end of today's session. The speaker's presentation and comments represent their own viewpoints and do not necessarily represent the views of DMA and DMANF. We hope that you enjoy today's webinar. Our speakers today are Kevin Schulman, CEO of DonorVoice, and Nick Ellinger, VP of Marketing Strategy for DonorVoice. With that, I'll turn over the presentation to Kevin.
Thanks, Jocelyn. We appreciate it, and appreciate the folks who have registered for the webinar today. So my job is to do a little bit of stage setting here and some behind the scenes on how this project came about and some of the underpinnings that went into designing the research study that we did in partnership with the DMA, and then Nick will walk you through the specific findings and get you to some hopefully very specific direction that you all can take around this issue of overhead and impact. So one of the things that we know as a business and is that there's a myriad of factors that go into the decision making around the choices that we make as human beings, and more specifically the choices we make to support or not support given organizations. And I was a bit of a myth buster fact here. As it turns out, people don't give because of the way that we make them feel. In fact, people don't make choices generally based on feeling a certain way. They actually make choices based on a feeling that they want to have. And in this context, the decision making, and a lot of this occurs at a subconscious level, for deciding whether to give or not to give, is this threshold question that they're trying to answer, and we'll go through some of what goes into this decision making. How am I going to feel as a result of my giving? And if I make a judgment on the front end, pre-decision to give, or as a part of that mental calculus to decide whether to give or not, if I decide I'm going to feel good, or if I'm going to have high regret if I don't give, then that will drive me towards a yes decision on that giving choice. Now, on the flip side, if I decide that I'm not going to feel different or badly or have any sort of regret with the decision to not give, that will make the decision for me. And so this threshold understanding around what's driving these sorts of choices is where we began this exercise, and in coordination with some of the folks on the education committee at DMA to give us some thinking and direction, we started to look at what are some of the factors under our control, under an organization's control, that might influence that judgment that folks are making about how they're going to feel as a result of giving. And so this next slide will show some of the factors that we, as a part of this study, isolated and explored. And Nick will walk through the details, but just to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour, going from sort of right to left and starting with Sophia seemed sleepy. One of the things that certainly might have an effect on this judgment about how I'm going to feel about the giving decision and post-giving is our ability to tell a narrative, to relate a story, and in this case, of an individual, right? So more broadly, just the messaging and the copy that we use in fundraising, whether that's online or offline. Presumably that it's reasonable to assume that might have some impact on that judgment about how they're going to feel. Moving on, continuing in order here, the personally, another sort of area that we explored with this study is what if they have some sort of connection to the cause, and in this case, looking at what if they have a connection to a disease charity because they are living with that disease or they're a caregiver. Certainly it's plausible that should have some impact on this judgment about how they're going to feel about supporting. Continuing clockwise fashion, the gift reply form, and again, we'll go into all the details that these visuals represent in shorthand. We looked at the idea of agency, which is sort of a wonky academic term for control, my sense of control. If I feel like I can direct my giving to a particular area, will that have an effect on my judgment about how I'm going to feel after giving? And then continuing on, there's the ubiquitous pie chart that is intended to reflect that the percentage of funds that go to administrative, i.e. overhead. So we also examined that as a part of all of this. And then last but not least, the effect of these external rating entities. Might that have some impact on the judgment about how I'm going to feel? So this became the set of factors or areas that we explored. There are many other factors, to be sure, that would influence this judgment that folks are making, but we've hopefully explored and lifted up quite a few rocks here and can show what we found. And then what I'm going to do next is go through what the existing body of evidence and knowledge says about a few of these, because we wanted to build on the body of knowledge that already exists and not just be redundant with that. So first, we'll take a look at what is in fact understood about this thing called overhead. And I'm going to simultaneously make the case that donors care about overhead, and then in the exact same breath make the case that they don't. So what exactly does that mean? So you can find all sorts of data, not least of which the little survey snippet off to the right, where if you ask people in some sort of survey format how they feel about overhead, they're going to express all sorts of levels of caring about that the overhead actually matters to them. What we're going to show is an experimental study that was more clever than that and was digging a little bit deeper on this question of overhead. So this is semi-complicated, so bear with me as I walk through the parts of this study. But again, this is, while more complicated and more sophisticated, it's a much better way to get an answer on what's actually going on with overhead than just asking kind of a simplistic survey question. So what you're seeing on the screen is that folks were presented with a few scenarios. And it was two organizations. You've got Kids Corp USA and Charity Water. And whenever they were shown Kids Corp USA, it was always in a no overhead condition, meaning that there was no overhead associated with your giving to Kids Corp. Now, they were making a decision about whether to give to Kids Corp or to Charity Water. And in Charity Water case, there were several different conditions that were presented. So in one instance, it was Charity Water with no overhead. So in that case, it's very much apples to apples on the overhead part of that mental equation. And then you're just deciding you want to give $100 to Kids Corp or Charity Water. But as you can see with Charity Water, there were some other conditions where the overhead started to go up. And then I was making a choice, or these folks who participated in the study were making a choice between Kids Corp, always no overhead, and Charity Water that went up to 5% overhead and 50% overhead. And then you'll see, interestingly, two conditions where same amount of overhead, 5 and 50, but the overhead's been covered. So in this case, there's a major donor who's given X amount of money. The X amount of money is being used to cover the overhead, okay? So let's take a look at this next slide, which, again, because it's from academia, it's a little bit wonky to follow, but bear with me and we'll walk through what you're seeing on the screen. So by way of orientation, we've got the percentage of overhead on the x-axis, that horizontal. And on the vertical axis, we have the percentage of people who chose charity water. So first take a look at the orange line, okay? And what you're seeing is, and relative to whatever that other color is, the grayish line. So when we look at those two lines in comparison, you see that when the overhead is covered, which is the orange line, there is no change between no overhead, which is over on the far left on that orange line, all the way up to 50%. So even though charity water in some of these conditions had half of the money coming in the door was going to overhead, as long as the person was told that in this instance, for this campaign, for your 10 bucks or your 100 bucks, it's all going to the cause, it doesn't matter what charity water's overhead is. 0%, 5%, 50, as long as it's covered, they don't care. Now that darker colored line below that, you can see that the proportion of people gets lesser, as you would expect, as the overhead goes up and it's not covered. Okay, so you can see that at the 0 condition or the 5% condition, it's about 63, 64% who chose it, and then it starts to drop down to around somewhere north of 50%, but south of 60, right? So, and those are statistically significant differences at the 50% versus the 5, okay? So, in summary, what the heck does this mean? This means donors couldn't care less about how you spend your donations as an organization. What they do care a heck of a lot about is how you spend their money. But as long as their money has no part of it being pushed to overhead, they intellectually and kind of separately and rationally couldn't care less what your overhead is. Hence our ability to argue out of both sides of our mouth that yes, they care, and no, they don't. All right. So there's a couple other pieces of existing research that we want to share that, again, is a little bit just behind the scenes tour on the process that we went through to design the study that we designed in order to augment what was already known. Go on to the next one there, Nick. Thank you, sir. So what's known about these rating entities? And in this case, we looked at, this particular study looks at Charity Navigator. There's no definitive evidence that what we're going to share here necessarily applies to the other kind of rating entities that are out there, but it'd be a reasonable sort of starting point that what we see here does apply regardless of whether it's Charity Navigator or others. And again, we're going to simultaneously argue that folks care about ratings, and in fact, no, they don't. So there is work that's been done that looked at the database, the data set that exists on Charity Navigator, so all those charities that have been rated by the organization. And kind of at a very macro level, what this study found, and I'm paraphrasing, but you can see the exact reference down below the URL, that if you went from 3 stars to 4 stars, so a 1-star increase, if you were able to achieve that as an organization, there was an anticipated or expected 19.5% increase in revenue. Okay, so there is a correlation at least between the number of ratings and revenue. However, as a part of that same body of work, what they also found is that moving from 3 stars to 4, which is not free, right? There are things that you as a business would presumably have to do, maybe want to do, but certainly have to do in order to kind of meaningfully and materially and specifically try to influence and change your charity rating. If the organizations within a given subsector, so for example, within the environmental sector, so if you look at the charities within the environmental sector that are rated by Charity Navigator, and then we take a look at within that cohort the groups that are relatively larger. So if you just sort of rank order them in a line, we see the ones that are bigger by virtue of revenue. Then for those charities, doesn't matter if you go from 3 stars to 4, has no effect on revenue. So what does this suggest? This suggests that they don't care about your ratings per se, right? What they care about is the quality of the organization. And what they're doing in the instances where the organization is less well known, and I'm using kind of revenue and size as a proxy for how well known the brand is. If you're less well known, then these Charity Navigator ratings, or perhaps others, kind of substitute for or serve as proxy for this judgment that's being made about the quality of your organization. However, if relative to your competitive set, you are well known as a brand, well, then that brand is probably doing the job that the Navigator ratings are doing, and therefore is completely irrelevant to their decision making because that mental factor's been accounted for. Okay. All right, and then I think we have one other piece of existing research that, again, is part of what we examined and brought to bear in designing this research. And I promise at the end of all of this, when you go through the study that Nick's going to walk you through, we're going to have some fairly prescriptive guidance on how to make use of not just what we examined, but it'll kind of indirectly pull in some of these findings and get you to more prescriptive guidance. But last but not least, on this existing research front, there was some work that was done, and this is a kind of recurring area of interest, especially for folks in the social sciences, academics, but also kind of in the practitioner world, is what role does effectiveness play? Right? Do people evaluate and have effectiveness information influence their choices? And in this case, we're talking about efficacy, right? We're talking about what's the demonstration that your business, your enterprise is actually having some sort of positive outcome on its beneficiaries. And this was a study that had kind of 2 conditions. And the first condition is what's described on the screen here. And if we gave people a choice of organizations, and they were all had the same general mission or sort of subsector within the charity space, and then you also provided effectiveness information. So we've got brand A, B, C, D, and E, and they're all generally in the cancer space or in the conservation space. And then you include effectiveness information. Folks disproportionately choose the one that's most effective. However, if you wind up giving participants a variety of causes, so now, just by way of illustration, I'm evaluating an arts charity and a conservation charity and a cancer charity and a social service charity, and you've got effectiveness information that goes along with each of those charities. As it turns out, they make the choice not based on which one's most effective, but they make the choice based on where they've got some sort of personal connection or preference. Okay? So there's a whole lot of giving that tends to be very autobiographical in nature. I'm going to give to the organization that I've got some sort of connection to. And once you get into that condition, which is probably a bit more real world, the kind of pure facts-based efficacy information goes out the window. It doesn't matter at all. Okay, and you can see the reference there. So bottom line on that piece of information is they care about what they care about, and that connection that they have, that innate connection they have based on who they are or the experiences they've lived out, or the people close to them have lived out, that's the driver of giving, not the effectiveness. All right, so I'm now going to hand this over to Nick, who is going to walk you through the study that we did to build on all this.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. And we had a couple of questions so far, so I'll jump in with those here in the section break. We had the question of whether you will get a copy of the slides, and yes, we will send those out after the presentation. We had a question of how much the brand affected the overhead impact in the Charity Water study, because Charity Water is better known. And the answer there is that the researchers controlled for that by testing Charity Water versus KidCore, both with 0% overhead. And in that case, about 70% of people or more chose Charity Water because more people know it. And then they tested versus that. So when you had 50% overhead in the case of Charity Water, that number dropped from over 70% to a little over 50%. So that's a significant drop. And then Kevin, one question that I did not remember the answer to that perhaps you did. In the 3-star to 4-star examples, do you know how high the revenue was of the charities that were considered larger? I did not remember that.
Yeah, well, with the caveat, I don't remember fully. I believe there is no absolute number, so it's all relative. So when they started to look within cohorts, and I believe the cohorts were grouped together based on some coding schema tied to IRS classifications or whatever that was. Then the groups that were just relatively speaking higher revenue, those were the ones where you found no effect. So there is not a magic absolute number that if your revenue's above X, then don't worry about the ratings.
So it's more of a spectrum. The better known you are, the less ratings matter.
Yeah, and then just to sort of play out a little bit of what we talked about and part of our counsel and direction. Look, where you got to decide where you're going to invest money. Are you going to invest money in building your brand, or are you going to invest money in trying to move the needle on the Charity Navigator ratings? And it would seem to us that most are going to make the choice for each incremental dollar, I'd rather build the brand, because that will probably also, as an ancillary bit, help you move that Navigator rating.
Okay, great. So what we want to look at now is the test. And the test that you're going to see is using DonorVoice's pretest tool system. And it's basically an A/B test on steroids. We're going to be looking at 5 different attributes that you could have in a mail package, an email, in some sort of communication. And then we're going to be looking at 5 different versions that we tested of each. And, well, why don't I just show that slide? So what we looked at is 5 different trust indicators. So the Charity Navigator seal versus a rating and a testimonial from a donor versus the DMA seal versus the Guide Star Platinum rating versus no trust indicator whatsoever. Then we looked at who you help. So in the narrative, are you giving tangible examples? Are you giving a testimonial from a person, an impact on one identifiable victim, stats, or an identifiable victim plus statistics? When you look at overhead, we looked at the traditional pie chart versus being very transparent about your low costs, versus an overhead-free lead gift. So like Kevin talked about from the research, if your gift is covered by, if the overhead for your gift is covered by someone else, are you more likely to give? And then reframing overhead with mental accounting. And then we tested no overhead presentation. Maybe if we don't talk about it, it will go away. On the reply, we looked at unrestricted giving versus restricted giving where it's needed most, versus agency over what your priorities are, versus being able to control the channel of communications that you would get from the organization. So which of these makes someone most likely to give? And then we looked at donor identity. Direct connection is I have had, we tested, we made up a fictitious cancer organization for this. Cancer worked as a concept because a large proportion of the population either has had or knows someone who has had cancer. And so you're able to look at identity variables in conjunction with this. So direct connection is I've had it or I've been a primary caregiver for someone who has had cancer. Indirect connection is I know someone or care about someone who has had cancer. And then no connection is I have not known anyone who's been impacted by cancer. And the way this loads into the pretest tool is you are given screens of an A option or a B option, kind of like you would at the optometrist when they're checking you for glasses. So do you prefer A or B, where A has an identity for a direct connection, it gives statistics and a full story, it includes the Charity Navigator seal, and it has transparency around fundraising costs. Versus B, where you have an indirect connection, you just have a story of Sophie, you have a donor testimonial, and then your gift reply form allows you to choose your channel, and you have a testimonial from a mother. And by giving all of these A versus B, you're able to find out not only which of these items, which item within an attribute is most preferred. So do people prefer the testimonial or the Charity Navigator seal, for example? But you're also able to find out how much of each one matters. So for example, if every time we put the Charity Navigator logo and 4 stars up there, people voted for it, then that is both the preferred option and the most important thing to get right. And we wanted to do this with donors to an organization that was not linked to cancer. And so there was a combination of donors to No Kid Hungry who volunteered to share their list, as did Mothers Against Drunk Driving. We're very appreciative of both organizations for being willing to do that. We also had an open link on Facebook to which we directed advertising from those people who wanted to take a charitable survey. That is a small portion of the list. And so each person went through 8 of these screens, so we tested 6,600 different packages, A versus B. This was an exciting project for me because I spent a number of years in different organizations as overhead, first in a public policy department and then in fundraising for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And so being able to frame to people the overhead that we have that's so necessary for our growth in a positive way, how do we either overcome it or highlight it in a way that was most impactful for donors was very close to my heart. Also, I should mention before I'm getting all of the business out of the way before we start telling results, because I'm sure that's why you're all here. Feel free to knock out any questions to me in the question box as we go through. I will try to answer them as we go, in addition to taking questions at the end. So with that drum roll complete, how important is each type of variable that we tested? Not surprisingly, the way that we frame overhead is actually the most important of any of these 5 attributes. That was in a tier of its own. The second tier was how do you create donor trust and how do you frame the donor's reply with donor control over their gift or channel or means of talking to you. And then in the lowest tier, these are important but not as important as the others. You have the how you help variable and the identity of the donor. And identity is a bit muddled, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So looking at how to frame overhead, all of these will come out, I should mention, on a 0 to 100 scale. And you can use them arithmetically to look at the preference rate. So for example, if something is rated a 60, it's about twice as preferred as something that's rated as a 30. So you'll see some starkly different ones, and then you'll see ones that have a couple of good options. Our goal with the pretest tool isn't to find the one platonic ideal that you should roll out with, but rather to give you a few different options. So how to frame overhead. Number 1, with a bullet and a star and a smiley face, is having a grant to cover all of the overhead costs associated with this communication. This very much ties into the research that Kevin mentioned, that if your overhead is covered by a gift, that is a very telling thing to donors. They want their gift to go entirely toward mission. And in fact, there are research studies that show that this type of lead gift covering overhead significantly outperforms a traditional match campaign. So we had anticipated it would do well. I got to say, I'm a little surprised to see a 98. That's very strong on these pretest tools. You rarely see numbers in that realm. Number two, at a 70, was the traditional pie chart treatment. And in this case, we gave the organization an 80-20 overhead split. Not too good, not too bad. Kind of around the average of where nonprofits fall, maybe a little bit better than the average. Then you'll see there's kind of a line here. The bottom three worked about as well. Not mentioning overhead worked as well as saying how low the fundraising costs were, worked about as well as asking an extra $5 to cover the cost of the communication. Little disappointed in those. We had a hypothesis saying that if people knew how inexpensive our packages were, perhaps they wouldn't be as fixated on overhead, but it turns out that just did not work. And while the extra $5 could help you raise, well, an extra $5, it doesn't help so much in terms of the overhead framing. So the study that I mentioned in terms of match versus overhead is they did 4 different conditions. One was standard. One was we've received $10,000, now we're trying to raise another $10,000. Then there was a traditional match. We've received $10,000 available to match your donation here today. And then there was a seed funding plus overhead. We've received $10,000, and that covers the cost of the overhead in this case. And it turns out that, yes, the seed funding and the match performed significantly better than the control. Not a lot of surprise there for those of you who run a match campaign. But that the overhead-free condition performed significantly better than the seed or the match alone. So this is a proven technique. It was gratifying to see it pop here in the results. And it's nice to see that that can work better, alternate ways of funding, than having just the traditional pie chart. Although having that education does outperform having no education about overhead whatsoever. Next, we wanted to look at our trust row. Here you will note that all trust indicators performed better than having no trust indicator. So any of these would be better than having nothing at all. The Charity Navigator rating was the best among these. Having a 4-star Charity Navigator rating seemed to be people that people really responded to that. GuideStar was next, followed by DMA certification, which is a bit of a cheat because there is not a DMA certified badge yet, but we did want to look at that to see if that's something that would be effective, and it turns out it is more effective than no trust indicator, followed by having a average user rating as well as a testimonial from a donor. I do see a question here that said, did we test the Better Business Bureau indicator? We did not. That was in one original version of the grid, but we wanted to test the DMA logo in addition. My guess is that we would find B2B functioning rather like the GuideStar or the DMA logo in this test. And someone's asking, did we test Charity Navigator 4-star versus 3-star? No, we did not. We wanted to look specifically at which trust indicator worked the best in this case. Okay. So in summary here, if you have a trust indicator, use it. Anything is better than nothing in these cases. And then we have the question, why do we assume the Better Business Bureau would not test as well as Charity Navigator? In some additional outside research, Charity Navigator is considered more known within the charity sector. Better Business Bureau is certainly well known, but it's better known for-profit businesses than non-for-profits. Okay. And there's a question about demographics. Communicating efficiency measures is most critical for older donors, according to their testing. I will say that we did not find any statistically significant differences on any demographics, whether size of gift to the organization, age, gender, ethnicity. But when you have 400 responses, those indicators tend to fall off a little bit. So there may be differences there that we're not finding in the results. Going ahead to the reply form, this is a really interesting one because it's something that I believe every organization can do. So we all know that donors want their gift to be restricted. Even if they're giving $5, they want it to go to their pet project. And yes, that some will choose the where needed most, but they really want to see their donors working, their gift going to impact where it's needed, where they want it to go. And that's what we found here. Not terribly surprising. Number 1 and number 2 were different forms of restricted giving. But number 3, almost as good, is the same message as our top respondent. Here are the 4 ways that you can help. But instead of saying, I want my gift to go towards, it just says, from your areas of work, my highest priority is. That's a statement that doesn't restrict the gift. And so what this shows is that the mechanism of having a person designate an area of a mission is mostly to be heard rather than to actually restrict their gift. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this one that has the 72 rating, significantly better than asking for no gift whatsoever. And then here at 45, again, better than doing nothing, is giving people the ability to control their communications. In other testing that's available on the DonorVoice website, you can find that this type of reply device is the most effective in helping someone opt into your organization for additional communications. So if you're running online campaigns that aren't donor-based, being able to designate the channel of additional communications will get more people to sign up for you. And then here in the basement is simply asking for a gift. And I bet you're all wondering, what does this happen? Does this have an impact when you put it into practice? And thankfully, our friends at the American Diabetes Association did this with their year-end giving program. We had done a pretest tool for them that had surfaced similar results. So this is their traditional reply device above. Then below, not quite, you have please help us win the fight against diabetes and sharing your highest priorities. So very simple implementation and similar to the one that's done previously. And I should mention that this was on an acquisition package. And so they have had a similar acquisition package for a few years. They've tested everything they could think of to test against it. Nothing's beat it until now. Because what we found was that allowing someone to share their highest priority led to a $3.40 increase in average gift, an 11.6% increase in revenue. So needless to say, what's on the bottom is their new control, which is really nice to see, that type of result from that simple a treatment. And I think a lot of our organizations have different mission areas that we work on, and allowing someone to vote with their reply device works and works well. In terms of who you help, marrying an individual story with statistics worked best, followed by statistics alone, then telling you what your gift will do, then a testimonial, and then an individual story of Sophia alone. And my daughter's name is Sophia, so this is my homage to her in the pretest tool. And then I told my wife about this, and she said, you gave our daughter cancer, so that was not perhaps the homage I was looking for. This was an interesting result for us because usually a statistical information doesn't work as well as an identifiable victim. So this was a test where they described what's going on in Malawi and Zambia, talking about the statistics that are going on in the area versus one specific identifiable victim from Mali, Rokia. And what they found was that the identifiable victim raised significantly more than the statistics. And in fact, the marrying of the identifiable victim and statistics didn't do as well as the identifiable victims alone. So why does this seem to contradict what we're seeing in these results? Well, a couple of things going on. First one is that this statistical victim one looks like it was copied out of the World Book Encyclopedia, and I realize I'm dating myself with that reference, so copied out of Wikipedia, I guess would be the modern version of that. That is stat heavy. Your eyes glaze over in reading it, so that could be a portion of it. But the other one, and we generally find that even when you don't go full World Book Encyclopedia, you still have identifiable victims feeding statistical victims. This stat used a trick that we're seeing more and more, which is more than one every hour. So here, even the statistic is bringing it back to the one. And so marrying it with, yes, there are 10,000 children diagnosed with cancer this year, more than one every hour, that's a child like Sophia. And so bringing it back to an individual really does help in this case. And it humanizes the statistic somewhat. At least that is our best guess. In terms of identity, we found that you know personally what it's like when you have cancer or are caring for someone with cancer, won out. And when we tested on the back end, that was the identity that the most people taking the survey had. And not surprisingly, when you matched the identity of the person who was taking the survey and the identity statement they identified with most, that tended to increase the response rate for that particular identity. What I would say this slide tells more than anything else is that you can increase results by matching the identity to the person that you're talking to. But on the flip side, it's not something that you want to guess. You don't want to say, you know what it's like when someone you know personally has cancer when they don't know that person. That is a turn off, as evidenced by it performing less than no identity at all. So, key findings in your traditional red, yellow, green format. Looking at overhead, the best option is to cover your overhead with a lead gift or something of the like. Failing that, use a pie chart to illustrate how your overhead is being used, but don't try to explain what your overhead is. This goes directly to the donors don't care how you spend your donations. They care greatly how you spend their donation. In terms of quality and trust indicator, Charity Navigator, if you have a 4-star rating, does seem to help. Failing that, any trust indicator, including donor testimonials, perform better than having no trust indicator whatsoever. In terms of donor control, restricted giving would be best. That said, I don't think anyone on this call, or at least I don't, want to start talking to all donors as if they can restrict their gift for all times. So I would say asking their giving preference is a really good way of going about things. And if for some reason your finance department is very uptight about such things, you can ask channel preference and still get a little bit of a bump. In terms of who you help, it's complicated, but marrying statistics to and bringing them down to a level that makes sense in terms of one every hour. And we've seen this in pretest tools with other clients. Statistics don't work unless they are 1 out of 6 or 1 every hour, bringing it down to that 1. But you shouldn't try to numb or guilt someone into giving. And then finally, identity works if you can know and match the donor's identity. You should never try to guess at a donor identity. And that's the challenge with a lot of modeling. they'll say, oh, there's an 80% chance that this person is, in a lookalike model, looks like the donors that you have. But by the same token, if you guess and guess wrong, that's something that can really damage your donor relationship. As to questions, I have the question again, will we get a copy of the presentation? Yes, we will send this out afterwards. Other questions from the audience? Kevin, anything as I was going through it that you wanted to highlight or that I missed while we are waiting for the questions to come in?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Then while you are typing your questions furiously, let me give a plug to our friends at the DMA Nonprofit Federation in Chicago in just 3 short weeks. We're going to be having the Multi-Channel Now conference. Hotel deadline is extended through the end of the week, so get in your hotels now, which is a reminder to me to get my hotel in. I am a deficient presenter, and I apologize for that, but I will get it in before August 10th, and hopefully you will as well. DMA folks, anything that you wanted to add on the conference? Oh, I'd add that you can go to shy.nonprofitfederation.org and see many of the wonderful sessions at the DMA Chicago conference, including one by our very own Kevin Schulman on this call. DMA folks, any other comments?
No, that's great. Just that it's going to be held at the Renaissance downtown hotel, so it's easy to get to. And hopefully we'll see you guys.
Great.
We'll see you guys there.
Okay.
Perfect. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks. And we have some questions coming in. One question is what I mean specifically by overhead. And I'm sorry then for throwing out that term and not defining it better. So overhead is the amount of money that nonprofits spend that doesn't go directly to the mission. It usually breaks out into management in general in one bucket and fundraising in the other bucket. And so that's often considered to be overhead. Oftentimes people will look at an overhead ratio to judge how, quote, efficient a nonprofit is. And so they'll say, oh, they're spending 86% of their money toward the mission. That's a really good thing. It is, in my opinion, a very misleading and destructive ratio, because those of us on the call know that if you had a magic box that you could put $1 into and get $1.50 out, as we can sometimes do in fundraising, you would sit by that box and start feeding dollar bills into it. Likewise with us, if you have the ability to get more money for the mission by spending a bit more on fundraising, you should do that. You will expand your mission. And while that may make your overhead ratio go down, it's for the benefit of those receiving the benefit of your mission. Question of, did this generate any research questions or things you tested differently? The biggest one that we have coming out of this, and we offered this to the leadership group and we'll also throw it open on this call, is we're very curious to see how these test results function in real life. So if you are interested in testing some of these results like American Diabetes did, please reach out. We have one of the very few behavioral scientists working exclusively on the nonprofit sector on the DonorVoice staff, and she'd love to work with you on testing this live, so that the next time we present this, we can say, and we took this to the next level with our testing. It worked in real life. Kevin, anything to add on that one?
No, I don't.
Okay. There's a question of, has there been any research done on the direct mail packaging, e.g. teaser text on the envelope, etc.? There is and there isn't. The first thing is that we tried to test these ideas as they would appear in a communication. And so we had, for example, the trust indicator at the top right of what would be the quote letter, unquote, in this case. That said, the ideas behind them can move fluidly. So some organizations do put, for example, the charity Navigator 4-star logo on the envelope, and this would tend to indicate that would increase response rate. That said, there's also research that says that the most effective envelope actually usually will have no teaser text on it at all. It will simply be something that gets the person into the envelope. That said, the best of the best teaser tests can get you inside the envelope better than a blank envelope, but those are few and far between. Kevin, anything else on the packaging side of things?
No.
Okay. What do you think about having overhead covered by a wealthy local foundation versus saying a generous donor versus naming an individual donor? What's your best guess? Thanks. There is one study that I know of on this that looked at the impact of saying that the lead gift had been provided by the Gates Foundation, and that increased response rate by, I believe, either response rate or total revenue by 20%. And the idea is the researchers believed that having the name as a part of the text, because people know the Gates Foundation, tended to validate the organization itself. So I would say, kind of like Kevin was talking about earlier in terms of the power of your brand versus Charity Navigators, if someone would recognize the local foundation and view it as a validator of your efforts to have their name associated with it, I would go for it. If not, I may shy away from it because then it's a distraction from you as an organization. You may not need that validator, and so that may come to the top more than naming an individual donor if it's not someone that someone would recognize. And then when the organization asked what people had a preference to do, did they try to direct the money that way, or did they just put it as unrestricted? In this pretest tool, people weren't actually donating. They were just voting A or B. And so people didn't actually have an option to choose a preference for the organization. In terms of diabetes, when they tested it, people did generally choose a preference for their top priority for the organization. But as that is not non-binding, it didn't have any impact on how their donation would be used. That said, we would advocate, if possible, to capture that information and then to play that offer back to folks. So if in the diabetes case, someone prefers cure messaging to treatment messaging, then they should be getting cure appeals all day long. And if someone prefers treatment messaging to cure messaging, vice versa, they should be getting treatment messaging. It's a really, in addition to lifting the response rate, you now have that information about why someone gives to the organization, which honestly is more valuable. If there are, I don't see any other questions. So if you do have questions, feel free to reach out. Kevin is kschulman at thedonorvoice.com, and I am N. Ellinger at thedonorvoice.com. And we are both available on various forms of social media and on the DonorVoice website at thedonorvoice.com. Thank you all for your time today. And let me kick it back over to the DMA staff. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time today. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully you learned a little bit about overhead and how to frame it. And hopefully you can put these results into action. If you want help doing that, feel free to reach out and we can help you with that. Thanks, everyone, and have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.